All right. The class tonight is on 1 Samuel chapter 14, and have handouts. If anybody did not get one on Sunday, raise your hand and I will get it to you. Yes. 1, 2. Who else does not have a handout for this class? Okay. All right. 1 Samuel chapter 14, we have been... we're kind of in the middle of this section that discusses the rejection of Saul as king. In 1 Samuel 13, of course, they were preparing for battle against the Philistines, and Saul waited, and people began to desert, and his army decreased in size, and it decreased in size, much like in the days of Gideon. And finally, instead of waiting the full allotted 7 days for Samuel, Saul offers the sacrifice, and right in the middle of that, Samuel shows up and says, "What is this you have done? Why have you not waited? You've disobeyed the Lord. The Lord has rejected you as king. Your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as a ruler over the people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." That's not a very happy note to start battle with in Saul's case. And what we're seeing here, chapter 14, the chapter division is not very good. I know I say that a lot, but this is particularly true here. And it's really kind of hard to pick a spot where the chapter division should have fallen because everything in chapters 13 and 14 deals with the same set of events. It's the same battle. And so chapter 14 is this, they actually have the battle that Saul was supposed to be preparing for. In chapter 13 ended with Samuel departing from Gilgal. Saul, he numbers the people, he takes inventory of them, and there is only 600 people left. Now you compare that to the Philistine numbers in verse 5 of chapter 13. They have 30,000 chariots. That means that for every Israelite soldier that's going to be involved in this battle, there are basically, what was the math? Like 50. There are 50 chariots to every one man. So it's 55. I think it's actually 500. I can't do math though, so it might be 50. The point is, what we see here is they're heavily outnumbered. They're not really prepared to fight this battle. But of course, the Lord has a knack for giving the victory to the smaller party anyway. So maybe we can see what's about to happen next. But not only do the Philistines have superior numbers and superior position, but they also have something else that Israel does not have. Actual weapons. Because we learned at the end of chapter 13 that there's no blacksmith in all the land of Israel. The Philistines had the blacksmiths. It's that awkward period in history where some nations have made the shift to the Iron Age and some nations haven't. And the Philistines have their blacksmiths and Israel doesn't. And they have to, even if they want to get their tools sharpened to be farmers, they have to go to the Philistines and pay for it. So the only sword and spear in the army are in the hands of Saul and Jonathan. Those are not good pictures from a secular perspective for how victory is going to work. But fortunately, that's not how the Lord operates. And in the first, let's go ahead and somebody read the first 5 verses of go ahead and read the first 15 verses of chapter 14.
All it is, Bill? At first, Gareth also.
All right. Now you look at what Jonathan does here. Is this a good idea from a human standpoint? Yeah, we'll get to that. That's what we're talking about, the divine standpoint. You're skipping ahead of me. But yes, he did have faith in God. From the human standpoint, no, this is not a good idea. His enemies have the high ground. The fight is over before it starts. They outnumber him, and verse 14 indicates that he and his armor bearer killed 20 men by themselves. So, it's basically, again, one guy for every 10 of them. What kind of man goes in? For that matter, what kind of man, what kind of commanding officer of any kind goes into battle without his army? Who does that? Nobody does that. And I think perhaps most interesting of all, in verse 1, Jonathan does not tell his father the plan. Why not? Yeah, his father's still kind of getting started on that, but he's probably, I don't think he's missed the way that Saul interacted with Samuel here. Perhaps he thinks Saul will simply try to talk him out of it. He doesn't just hide it from his father, he hides it from all of the people, what he is about to do in verse 3. He doesn't tell anybody except his armor bearer. He takes this one guy with him, and they go and they pick a fight with the Philistine garrison. There's a couple other points of interest. Verse 3, we have a parenthetical note about Ahijah, the priest. Ahijah is the son of Ahitub. Ahitub is Ichabod's brother. Ichabod was the son of Phinehas, who was the son of Eli. We remember Eli from the beginning of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel 2, there was a prophecy made that the Lord would break the strength of Eli's house and take it away and give it to somebody else who would be priest over Israel. Now, that hasn't really been finished yet, because Eli still has sons involved in the priesthood. It isn't until 1 Kings chapter 2 that prophecy is said to have been fulfilled. Whenever Abiathar, one of the descendants of these guys, is dismissed, and he is replaced by Zadok, the high priest. I'm not sure. It's kind of hard to I'm hesitant to pass judgment on Ahijah, or later on we're going to see Ahimelech and Abiathar were also part of this family. And they weren't necessarily bad guys, but the end result of this whole situation is that the priesthood is taken away from Eli's house. I don't know if we can read that into it or not. I have to think about that. We see but from the human perspective, Jonathan's strategy is not the best idea, but it works. Why? Because God was with him. Jonathan has a rather unique philosophy of going into battle. In verse 6, he says that the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. That's an important statement, especially in the context of this chapter. Back in chapter 13, Saul only recruited 3,000 men into his army. He sent everybody else home. He said, we don't need the biggest possible army. We just need this group of 3,000 people. And then some of those people start to desert, and suddenly Saul starts to get nervous, and the people start to get nervous. And suddenly it's like, oh no, well, maybe we really are too few now. But Jonathan still has the right idea in verse 6. It doesn't matter how many people go into battle. The Lord does not need 600 people in the battle. He doesn't need 2 people in the battle. He doesn't really need 1 person in the battle. He could do it himself. He's defeated people single-handedly before. Jonathan says up front, the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. Up to this point, we've had no mention of David in the story. Chapter 13 simply says that, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him as a ruler over his people. And, if we haven't met David yet, we may, as the reader, be scratching our head going, well, maybe he was talking about Jonathan. Maybe he's the man after God's own heart. Of course, by the end of the story, we see that's not the case. The Lord has something completely different in mind. But I think that the text is kind of, leading us down that avenue a little bit to get us to think about it. Jonathan's perspective on battle is correct, and we're going to see it later in chapter 17, when David goes out to fight Goliath, David's basic attitude towards it is, it doesn't matter who goes out and fights the giant. He'll win because the giant is blaspheming the Lord. And the Lord is not going to allow that to stand. So it doesn't matter who goes out and fights the battle. The soldier that, the particular soldier that does it is not unique because, David's not the real hero in the fight against Goliath. God is. David is just the instrument through which the purpose is accomplished. God doesn't need military might to win a battle. Verses 8 through 10, Jonathan and his armor bearer kind of arrange a test. He says, we're going to reveal ourselves. And if the Philistines say, oh, come up to us, we're going to take that as a sign that the Lord has given them over into our hands. But if they say, oh, wait here and we'll come down to you, then we're not going to go up. We'll stay here instead. But Jonathan's sighing, he considers this a sign from the Lord. And the Lord confirms their sighing in verse 11. The Philistines see Jonathan. They say, the Hebrews have come out of their holes in the ground. Remember back in chapter 13 and verse 6, some of the Israelite people were hiding in caves and thickets and cliffs and cellars and in pits. They're hiding from the Philistines because they don't think they can win this. The Philistines see them come out. Oh, yeah, now we've got them. Now we want you to come up here so we can tell you something. Well, why did they want to do that? We can only speculate. Were they planning to kill them? Were they planning to take them prisoner? Were they planning to interrogate them and get the position of everybody else? I don't know. But Jonathan sees his sighing is fulfilled. He gets up and he kills the Philistines. And they fall before Jonathan and his armor bearer. And it doesn't really, it doesn't describe it in great detail. It just says that 20 fell before 2. There's great trembling in the camp. In verse 15, there's the sheer display of power has put the enemy in a state of fear. And where Israel was trembling in chapter 13 in verse 7, the Philistines now tremble in chapter 14 in verse 15. Now that brings us to the next part of this sequence, Saul's response. Any comments or questions down to verse 15? All right, somebody read verses 16 through 23.
They also likewise, when all men forgive themselves perfect hard after the Lord.
All right. So Saul's watchman is looking out and he sees the Philistine camp. There's this commotion going on and they're melting away and they're fleeing in all directions. And the first thing Saul wants to know is, who's not here? Who started this? Count out and lo and behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer are missing from the rest of Saul's company. So they have struck out on their own. They've broken ranks. They've started this commotion. And Saul calls for the Ark of the Covenant at this point. Why would Saul do that? And just ask that question. What's the point? Huh? Maybe he's ready to join up with God again. Okay, what did they do with the Ark of the Covenant? We've seen the Ark a couple times before. And, the last time we saw the Ark on the field of battle, it wasn't necessarily a good thing either. Now here, what was Israel supposed to do with the Ark? Let me ask that. Anybody remember? They're supposed to carry it ahead of them, okay? Yeah. One function of the ark is its connection with the priest and the ephod that the priest wore and the means of inquiring of God is the idea that we're thinking about. What happened, the priest wears this linen ephod, and it contained the Urim and the Thummim. And exactly what the Urim and the Thummim are, we're kind of iffy about. We know that they use them to cast lots, and they use them to inquire of God. It's not 100% certain, probably the most popular theory is that they're basically light and dark colored rocks that they would pull out of the pouch and examine. I don't know how that works, because sometimes the Lord doesn't give any answer. So if there's a third stone in there, that's the maybe stone, I have no idea. But anyway, the point of that is that it's supposed to be a means of inquiring of God. And what we're going to see here is, Saul calls for the ark. It's apparent that he wants to inquire of God. It's actually in Judges chapter 20. Israel is only given victory in Judges 20 verse 27 after they inquire of the ark. You remember that. So Saul inquires of God, and then in verse 19 he says, "Withdraw your hand." What does that mean? He sees a bunch of commotion in the camp of the Philistines, and he tells the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Never mind. Yeah. Well, how do we explain that? How do we interpret that? Yeah. It is kind of interesting here. The priest is presumably about to cast lots to tell him the Lord's decision. Saul stops him from doing this, says, "No, let's make a decision without completing the inquiry." Then he figures he has enough information already. Now, they do win the battle. But I think we see something here about Saul, too. We see that, Saul's frequent characteristic, just like in chapter 13, he wouldn't wait for Samuel to offer the sacrifice. 14, he's not going to wait for a decision from the Lord. He's going to go and do what he wants. And that problem is going to get him into trouble. We're going to see, his failure to wait on the Lord, his impulsivity is what gets him into trouble throughout this story. Is impulsivity a word? I forget. All right, there you go. So that's what he did. Instead, Saul acts by rallying the Israelites to battle. There's no inquiry of God here. And even though Saul fails to consult Yahweh, Yahweh still grants them victory in verses 21 through 23. And again, we don't get a lot of detail in the battle. We just get the Philistines being routed and having to flee in all directions. And the Israelites are pursuing them. Verse 23 explicitly attributes victory to God. The Lord delivered Israel that day, and the battle spread beyond Bethaven. Now we come to the aftermath of said battle. And somebody read verses 24 through 30.
Men of Israel, first, but first,
Right.
but Paul said, first, bring here, for love. Lord,
Yeah. Well, actually, it was verse 30 we were supposed to go to, but yeah, But verse 35 is a good stopping point too. Okay. All right. So first of all, Saul proclaims an oath. Nobody's allowed to eat anything until I have avenged myself on my enemies. Why does Saul proclaim this oath? Why would Saul do something like that? No. He must have what? Yeah. No, I mean, what is he trying to accomplish with this, I guess? It's like, everybody's going to suffer until I get what I want, right? It's it's kind of interesting. Was this a good idea? Well, keep reading. We obviously see what Jonathan thought of the whole affair. It was not a good idea because you just basically subverted your entire purpose. You could have actually caught them had you let the people eat, but you didn't. It's kind of interesting here. Most vows in the Bible are kind of personal things. Somebody vows to give God a sacrifice or perform a service in exchange for God granting them a favor. This is one of the few instances where somebody actually imposes a vow on everybody else. Now, there's no passage in the law that really discusses that. So it's kind of hard to figure out what to do with it exactly. But just as Saul's... Let me ask you something. Who does this remind us of? Any other famous Bible character Saul remind us of here? Was there a sarcastic remark? You don't think it's Jesus? The answer is not Jesus. Very good. Yeah. You remember? Jephthah. Yes, there you go. All right, Jephthah. Just as Saul kind of reminds us of different judges at times. He reminds us of Gideon when his army's decreasing. He reminds us of Jephthah when he makes dumb vows. I mean, it's probably made with a motive of we got to keep everybody busy until we get what we want. Nobody takes a lunch break. We're going to work till we get this done. Well, of course, Jonathan later points out that this vow was actually accomplished the opposite of what was intended. The army keeps the vow. They do what Saul said. They walk right past that honey on the ground. They really want it, but they have to, don't look at that. Don't eat that. Don't put your hand to your mouth. But Jonathan, verse 28 indicates that the people were weary. Jonathan, in verse 29 and 30, he points out that Jonathan, he didn't hear about his father making the vow. I guess turnabout is fair play. Jonathan didn't tell his father about his military strategy, and his father didn't tell him about his crazy vow. So, like the plot of many a sitcom, this wouldn't have happened if they had cell phones, but there you go. Jonathan eats the honey, and his eyes brighten, and he realizes, oh yeah, this is refreshing, but the people say, your father pronounced a curse on anybody that does this. And, he's troubled Israel this day. His eyes brightened at the taste of honey. If the people had eaten freely of the spoil, they would have had the energy to pursue the Philistines and destroy them. But now, the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great. And then in the next part, in verses 31 through 34, what's wrong with this situation here? They're eating blood. That's not such a big deal, right? It's against the law. Eating blood is mentioned a lot in the law, actually. I was kind of interested to learn that. Genesis 9:4, it's one of the first things God says to Noah when he gets off the ark. You can eat meat now. They couldn't eat meat before the flood. But after the flood, they could eat meat. And God says, you can eat meat now, but you still can't eat blood. And he pronounces also the avenger blood law on that occasion. You can also read Leviticus and Deuteronomy both extensively talk about the rule. You don't eat blood because life is in the blood. It's one of the few laws from the Old Testament that's explicitly carried over into the New Testament. In Acts chapter 15, James tells them you have to abstain from things sacrificed to idols, and from fornication, and from blood. He lists those three things and puts them into the same category. Those things are absolutely forbidden in Acts chapter 15 in verses 20 and 29 and chapter 21 verse 25. Just kind of wonder if Saul had let the people eat in the first place, they might not have been so crazy greedy. And you know what? Saul, for all of his foolishness, one thing he does know? Eating blood is wrong. Verse 33, we don't eat blood. This is wrong. We're going to stop this. And they bring out a great stone. It's kind of hard to tell what he's planning to do with that. The main purpose that's probably been suggested for it is, the stone's going to function as an altar for them to drain the blood, and as opposed to them slaughtering the animals on the ground where they don't drain the blood. They bring out the big stone, and he instructs the people not to sin against the Lord by eating blood. And in verse 35, the text remarks that Saul built an altar. This is Saul's first altar. It is kind of interesting. Saul has no problem offering sacrifices. That's not Saul's major issue. He doesn't have any hang-ups with the cultic laws or the ritual laws or things like that. Saul's problem is, we're going to offer the sacrifice at the expense of doing what God said, at the expense of obedience. That was his problem in chapter 13. That's going to be his problem in chapter 15. It's his failure to obey in the interest of offering sacrifice. Okay, now verses 36 through 46, unless anybody has any comments or questions to throw in. We've got to work out the aftermath of this vow that Saul made. Somebody read verses 36 through 46. All right. So here, Saul decides, okay, let's go attack the Philistines by night. And the priest kind of reminds him, hey, we need to inquire of the Lord still. We haven't done that yet. Let's seek the Lord. Well, let's draw near to God here, he says at the end of verse 36. So they inquire of God, finally. And the Lord gives no answer. Why does the Lord give no answer? Apparently, yeah. Somebody's broken the vow. They don't put it together quite yet, but They know something's wrong because God's not answering them that day. Verse 37, so Saul basically says, okay, let's round up all the people. Let's get them together. And and in verse 39, he makes another vow. As the Lord lives, who delivers Israel, though it is in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. And in other words, even if Jonathan's the guy who violated this, we'll put him to death. And he says, as the Lord lives. It's a statement, it's another vow. I think we need to realize taking a foolish vow is actually a violation of the third commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. That phrase, don't take the name of God in vain, is frequently interpreted in our modern culture to be using the word God or some divine title in a bad or irreverent way, or pairing it with an expletive or something like that. That's a bad thing to do. That's not what the third commandment's talking about. The third commandment is talking about false vows. We obviously need to be careful about corrupt and unedifying speech, but that's not what the third commandment was meant to address. The third commandment's primary purpose is to address lifting up the name of God for vanity. In this case, making foolish or false vows. And so whenever Saul prefaces an oath with, as the Lord lives, I plan to do this, and then he doesn't do it, he's taking the name of the Lord in vain. He's lifting up the Lord's name for vanity, for futility. And he does that several times in this chapter. He pronounces a curse in verse 24. He actually uses the Lord's name in verse 39, and we're going to see it again in verse 45. He makes 3 foolish vows in this chapter. And so he keeps going. What he sets up here, I just can't help but think this would have turned into an elaborate game of 20 questions had Saul and Jonathan not been indicated by the lot. There's one other little factor I think we need to be aware of. In verse 41, did anybody have something different in verse 41 in their Bible? Because there's particularly if you're reading like an ESV or a Net Bible or something like that. Now, I don't know what versions are actually represented in this room, so. In verse 41, the Hebrew text is actually damaged. The Septuagint restores the original reading reflected in the ESV, the Net Bible, and a few others. And it reads as follows, therefore Saul said, O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant this day? If this guilt is in me or in Jonathan my son, O Lord God of Israel, give Urim. But if this guilt is in your people Israel, give Thummim. Most versions that don't include that will translate, because all it says is give Thummim in the Hebrew text. So most versions will translate it something to the effect of give a perfect lot, because frankly they don't know what to do with it. But the textual variant, again, it doesn't change a lot, but it gives us a little peek into how casting lots really works. Is, give Urim if it's this way, give Thummim if it's that way. And the Lord would give one or the other depending on the circumstance. So they narrow it down to Saul and Jonathan. If it had been the people, they would have, okay, if it's this guy, give Urim. If it's this guy, give Thummim. They could do that all day. But it's down to Saul and Jonathan. And they cast the lots between the two of them in verse 42. And Jonathan is indicated by the lot. He is indicated as the problem. He is indicated as the reason that the Lord is not answering the inquiry. And, the fact that God singles out Jonathan here, it's kind of interesting. The Lord does consider Jonathan at fault for breaking the vow of a king, even though Jonathan wasn't aware of it. Now that might not seem fair to us. But is there something we can learn from that? Yeah. It says something about, the law does distinguish between intentional and unintentional sins. But even unintentional sins can be punished by God. They're still worthy of punishment in some cases. In this case, even death. And Jonathan singled out. He confesses to his father what he's done. I broke your vow. Here I am. I must die. Jonathan has resigned himself to his fate here. And Saul's response to this in verse 44 is to swear another foolish vow for the third time. May God do this to me and more also, if for you shall surely die, Jonathan. And, it's only with the people's restraint that Saul does not carry out his vow. And there's a couple of interesting things about that. The people rescued Jonathan that day. Jonathan does die later. On the same day that Saul dies, the Lord did do to him and more also what he said he would do to Jonathan in chapter 31. it's interesting to see that the monarch of Israel didn't really have completely monolithic power. The people could apparently stop him from executing someone like this, even his own son. He actually gets overruled by his own people. There's a sense in which Samuel's prophecy is starting to come true. The Lord is taking your rule away from you. He's taking your kingdom away from you. Now you have a nation that won't submit to you. He's going to give it to somebody else altogether. All right. And in verse 46, we find out that battle that Saul's planning from verse 36 doesn't really take place. Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines. The Philistines went to their own place. Everybody lives to fight another day. So it's just kind of to summarize what happens. We see in the battle in chapters 13 and 14, Saul fails to wait on Samuel before offering the battle sacrifice, and God subsequently rejects him as king. Saul fails to inquire of God when he should, and God subsequently doesn't answer him when he comes back to inquire. Saul swears foolishly 3 times in this chapter, and these vows cost him his victory, his son, and ultimately his life. When you swear something like, may God do so to me and more also, God will eventually do that to you. And that's what happens to Saul later on in the story. These vows also indirectly cause the people to defile themselves by eating blood. They eat meat with blood in it. They defile themselves and and then later on they prevent Saul from actually fulfilling his vow. So it's one of those stories where there really is no right party except the Lord. It's not a happy situation in Saul's reign. Okay. Anything up to the end of verse 46? Very quickly, cover the rest of the chapter. I'll read this section. Now when Saul had taken the kingdom over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, the sons of Ammon, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines, and wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment. He acted valiantly and defeated the Amalekites and delivered Israel from the hands of those who plundered them. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan and Ishvi and Machlishua, and the names of his two daughters were these: the name of the firstborn Merab, and the name of the younger Michal. The name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the captain of his army was Abner, the son of Ner, Saul's uncle. Kish was the father of Saul, and Ner, the father of Abner, was the son of Abiel. Now the war against the Philistines was severe all the days of Saul, and when Saul saw any mighty man or any valiant man, he attached him to his staff. I have this written wrong on the question sheet, but in verse 47 there's a statement, Saul fought his enemies on every side. Now how does that compare to future kings of Israel when God talks about them? What was it that God gave to David? Yeah, he gave him, in chapter 7 and verse 1, he gave him rest on every side. It says the same thing about Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 5 and verse 4. The Lord has given me rest on every side. The Lord gave David and Solomon rest on every side, but that wasn't true of Saul. Saul fought his enemies on every side. Constant warfare throughout his reign. That's true. It's interesting, David fights a lot of wars, but the Bible still says he got rest on every side. It doesn't say that about Saul. Saul never found rest. And that's one of the sad things about Saul's reign. Again, is his disobedience to God prevents him from finding that rest ultimately. He tries to accomplish it on his own ultimately. He's too self-dependent, self-reliant. You get to verse 52, Saul's entire battle strategy, his entire military philosophy has changed. At the beginning of chapter 13, he was dismissing people. He's saying, we don't want the army to get too big, following the precedent set in Deuteronomy chapter 20. But in the end of chapter 14, Saul sees any mighty man or any valiant man, he drafts him. He attaches him to his staff. Saul has gone from being somewhat reliant on the Lord to not being reliant on the Lord at all. He has begun to trust God less and less and less. The rest of this section is basically a summary of Saul's reign. His sons, his daughters, his wife. Fun fact, Saul, I think, is one of the few monarchs in Israel's history that was not a polygamist, actually. He only has one recorded wife in Scripture. David had many wives. Solomon had even more wives than that. But Saul was a one-woman man. So he's had that going for him, at least, I guess. Also, we're introduced to Abner, who will be important later. Abner was the son of Ner. The name Abner means my father is Ner, so they weren't very creative with naming their child, but I was just reading what it says there. But But all that information is just kind of to tell you, again, it's a summary of who Saul was. Next time, we'll look at chapter 15 and yet another rejection of Saul as king. Any comments or questions? All right, we're done for today.